Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Office Hours, the stream where I take your Microsoft database questions and talk through my opinions. I think it's kind of useful as in terms of a stream as opposed to, there are a lot of places that you can go to get things like ChatGPT or Stack Overflow where you can go to get a wide variety of answers. This stream's really useful if you follow me personally, like if you read my blog posts and have some kind of faith or credibility in whatever it is that I personally say and you want my opinion about something. It's also a good fit for things that are relatively short, for things that you can fit into a small short Q&A, although often I go and rant for quite a while about the answers. So we'll take your top voted question from PollGab. The top voted question, oh, I have an extra light on here. Let me turn that off. The top voted question from PollGab is from Chandwich, who asks, if SQL Server Management Studio had a dark mode option that was just as good as the light mode, would you use it? And any idea why it doesn't exist? I think Microsoft tends to focus on doing things that will improve licensing revenue, and who could blame them, right? Like that they need to make money just like you and I need to make money. Although Microsoft has so much money, I don't know that they really need to make that much more quickly. But so obviously they focus on things that will move the needle, so to speak, in terms of revenue. I don't think that they put a whole lot of work in things that don't move the needle for free software. Because remember, Management Studio's free, totally free. You've never paid $1 in your life for it. I would argue that it's good enough to do what it needs to do. And the investment that they have to put into it, that Microsoft has to put into Management Studio, really relates more with keeping up with Azure SQL DB managed instances changes, hyperscales changes, new features that they add to SQL Server. Like if they add a new feature, they need to add manageability tools for it. I would actually rather that they focus, if they only have a limited amount of staff budget to fix stuff, I would actually rather that they focus on things that will make a meaningful difference in how people get their jobs done. And I'm going to give you an example. Troubleshooting always-on availability groups. Since always-on availability groups came out, like SQL Server 2012, over a decade ago, there haven't been any meaningful improvements to the troubleshooting UI inside of Management Studio. As far as I'm aware, you can't even still read cluster logs inside of Management Studio, and it's Management Studio. It's supposed to be able to manage stuff, right? So, do I want dark mode? I'd really rather them have fixed things like always-on availability groups troubleshooting. I get that people want a pony, but Microsoft does this really good exercise, and it's been more than a decade since I've been involved this closely with Microsoft, like giving personal feedback. But they used to do this really cool exercise where they would gather a bunch of paying customers in a room, and they would lay out a bunch of tables with different descriptions of features on the tables. Like they'd say, let's just say Hadoop, or always-on availability groups, multiple synchronous commit across regions. They'd have different features, and they would say, how much would you pay for this feature? And you were given a stack of Monopoly money. So you could go around the room, and odds are there were a lot of features you wanted, but you only had a certain amount of Monopoly money. You could either put all your money on one specific thing, or you could spread it out amongst a few things. And then at the end of it, after all the customers had walked around and looked at the different features, then Microsoft would say, okay, so it looks like most of you would pay the most imaginary money on this specific feature. That's probably the one that I should focus on improving. Alan says over in the chat, I used to use a text document, and then people said basically, oh no, yeah, text documents don't work as well for this. You want something that people can see, of course. So it worked really well for people to understand what their different choices were and what the cost was of putting your money on a certain thing. I would imagine that all of us like to think that we would put some money on dark mode, because I use dark mode after all. I mean, it is 4:45 in the morning and I've already been working for the last 2 hours because of my weirdo schedule. But the reality is when you see some of the other features that you might want, like in my case, availability groups troubleshooting, I think I'd rather have those. So there you go. Yes, Tadim says over in the TikTok chat, an illegal mix of collations. Yes, fixing collation problems, I would probably put a higher dollar amount on that than I would of dark mode. Because if you've ever had to try to change a database from one collation to another and move all of the existing data across, that is incredibly painful. That is a giant pain in the rear. And while I don't have to fix that too often, when I do have to fix it, it is such a bigger pain than dark mode that I couldn't care less. Couldn't care less about dark mode, I mean. Next up, DBA Jr. asks over in PolGab, hi Brent, what do you think about the DP300 exam certification? How do you think, or do you think it's effective for finding a DBA job, and is it important to companies? I did a recent short live stream on this, of talking about which certification to choose. And all it boils down to is right now, because of the economy and the hiring situation, for any given posted job, there are way more applicants than human resources can possibly interview. If you apply for a job at Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, whatever, you are competing against hundreds, if not thousands of other strangers looking for that same job. So the recruiters need something that they can very quickly just filter out a lot of applicants. The thing that they use for that is typically certifications. Is the certification any good? Not really. I don't think it really measures what people do on a daily basis. It just measures things that Microsoft or other companies in other cert cases want you to know. So because of that, I really don't place any faith in it. I think the certifications are pretty much garbage, but if you're competing against strangers, you don't really have a choice. You have to go through and check those off. I would also argue that the instant that you're competing against strangers for a job, you're also just kind of well screwed. The best jobs that you'll ever go find will come from someone you know. That's also why everyone that you work with, I don't care if you're looking for a job right now or not, everyone that you work with, you should always treat as one of your future coworkers. They're the people who are going to get you your next job. And so build out that Rolodex. Rolodex is such an ancient technical term, right? Build out the list of people that you talk to on a regular basis every month. Check in with everyone you've ever worked with, people who've moved on to other companies. Just say, hey, I was thinking about you. Here's what I'm up to. Tell me what you're up to this month. You can copy paste the stuff into multiple emails to make your life easier, but stay in touch with those people because they are your future route to your next jobs. I know you think you suck really bad at doing your job, but the reality is you don't. You're not as bad as you think, and your coworkers' memories aren't that good. So they're going to be tempted to say, oh, by the way, if you're not happy, we were hiring for a blank job over at this company that I'm at. If you know anybody who's interested, please come our way. So that's always helpful. Next up, MyTeaGotCold asks, what are the biggest disadvantages of using Amazon RDS SQL Server instead of EC2? RDS is like hiring Amazon to be your DBA. And DBA, you know, we kind of jokingly say that DBA stands for don't bother asking. Like you want something, but don't bother asking the DBA because they're going to say no. Well, having Amazon RDS or Azure SQL DB or Google Cloud SQL is like having someone else be your DBA. They're going to say, nope, you can't have that. Nope, you can't have that. Specific cumulative updates, latest versions, SA, literally the login SA, you're probably not going to be allowed to have that. You'll have something similar, but not quite SA. But also sketchy database features. And I'll give you an example: synchronous cross-region replication. If you want to have your primary data center in US East and your secondary data center in US West, and you want to do sync availability groups across those, RDS will not let you do that. RDS says, I'm sorry, that's suicidal. You would never do synchronous replication across the United States. We'll give you synchronous replication for two servers that sit next to each other in two availability zones, but not across regions. And like we see with sometimes Amazon or Azure will have failures that take out an entire region. Amazon lost US East 2 weeks ago. Azure lost their entire central US region 3 weeks ago. Sometimes you want synchronous failover across multiple or across a couple of regions. Again, it's sketchy. You know, your commit times are going to be terrible. But if you want things like that, you can't have it. So that's the big disadvantage with RDS, is that you can't do things that you may want to do but are not necessarily well advised from a systems perspective. Yukio says, what are the top skill gaps that you see in DBAs? What are the top skill gaps that I see in DBAs? I'm going to give you one you're probably not going to like. You already have most of the technical skills that you need to succeed. What you probably don't have are the personal skills. And I don't say that in a condescending way. I say that as me personally too. I constantly have to work on my own personal skills. Might find that hard to believe with how I talk to TikTok commenters. Ronio says, I think performance tuning. And I would agree that most DBAs can't read execution plans, can't find the bottleneck in an execution plan, believe too much in execution plans, things like that. But I think that most of us, where we get frustrated is that we believe something. We're like, I know that the problem with this application is that the queries are garbage. And then at the same time we say, I keep saying what it is and no one will listen to me. Very often when I come in as a consultant, my job is to advise companies on what to do. And we'll get all the way done and I'll have this nice written findings and we'll walk through them together and management will say, that's great, Brent made a totally great case for that and we're going to do it. And then the DBA will say, I've been telling you the same thing for a year and no one would listen. Part of the reason behind that is because a person from outside always carries more weight, at least initially. But another part of that is that I'll ask the DBA, and I can't tell you how many times this has happened. I'll ask the DBA, show me the advice that you gave people in writing. Show me the advice that you gave. Show me the findings that you came up with. Show me the case that you made for your point. Well, I've just been telling them. I tell them all the time. I put it in emails. I put it in... Show it to me. Show me the start to finish case that you made for what it was that you wanted. Well, I never really did that. Exactly. You have to learn to communicate what it is that you want in a clear and straightforward way. And when you can learn to do that and put it in a logical form that's not emotional and you just matter of fact, here's what we need to do and here's why and here's my evidence, here's the solutions that won't work. When you learn to do that, your career will just absolutely take off. Focus on that for a while. Like ask yourself, when was the last time that I read a communications book, watched a communications course, gave a presentation, and focus on that for a little while instead of just say, for example, performance tuning. Leo Gonzalez over in TikTok chat says, hi, howdy. Next up, DataGuy over in PolGab asks, assuming that a table does not have range scans or order bys, why should a clustered index be added? The one big one for sure is joins. As soon as you start joining between one table to another, joins will make it a whole lot easier if you do a clustered index on whatever that primary key is that you frequently join on, and that can be a huge help there. He follows on with, heaps get a lot of hate, but maintaining them nightly with Enterprise Edition isn't that big of a deal. Blindly adding clustered indexes to the PK fields means worse performance for the non-clustered indexes. DataGuy, so you're missing all kinds of points. I will say there are great valid use cases for heaps, and I wish I could explain this issue in a nice, concise way, but that's where I have my mastering courses. It's time for you to check out Mastering Index Tuning, and I have a whole module on heaps, and I measure where they're better and where they're worse. But you're missing, especially when you say no range scans or order bys, you're missing the whole big point of it. Now, it's great that you're curious. It's great that you're on the right track, but the reality there is you're missing all kinds of things that are very useful for clustered indexes, and you're missing the drawbacks for heaps. So check out my Mastering Index Tuning class. For those of you who are just joining on TikTok or watching the YouTube streams randomly, I have a whole set of training classes. If you go to brentozar.com or link in my bio and go to training, I have tons of training classes. I have free training classes, fundamentals training classes, and then mastering training classes. If you haven't signed up for my free ones, totally start there. I don't want your money until after you finish the free classes. For a lot of people, the free classes are such eye-openers that they go, oh my God, I had no idea how much I was missing. And the free classes will take them for the first year or two of their career. Then they can dig on deeper into the fundamentals and mastering. Next up, Ozan asks, hi Brent, when a SQL Server patch gets released, it makes sense to wait a while because it might be buggy or have unexpected surprises. Do you know a reliable source or a community location where you can figure out if a patch is safe? No, and I think that that is a missing element of the community that I would love to see. I would love to see a registry where when you have a reproducible problem or an open support case with Microsoft with a specific KB article or with a specific patch level, that you would go there, register, and say, here are the problems that I'm having with this patch, and then be able to add on and say, here's the current status of it, here's how Microsoft helped me to fix it. Because right now it's kind of a black hole. People will go add the cumulative update, and then they'll have problems, and they won't know, they won't be able to communicate it clearly to other people in the community. I do run SQLServerUpdates.com, but I've never put the work into it to make it that interactive so people could follow and put blog posts or write posts about the problems they're having with a CU. It's something that I've always thought about doing, but I've never put the work in yet. It is missing though. I would love to see that in the community. We don't have it today. Next up, Meg Thomas. Oh, that's a DBD reference, Dead by Daylight reference, and I absolutely love it. Says, does block size matter when using NVMe storage in cloud SSDs? Oh, and Wiron, I saw your question. I'll answer that here in a minute. So does it matter? So the thing is, in the cloud, you don't know what NVMe brand they're using. It can change at any time. The cloud vendor may use lots of different ones, and as your VM is moved from one piece of hardware to another, your storage will change underneath. So is there any way to accurately measure this, especially across multiple kinds of workloads? Not even at all. Might it matter on some specific combinations of VM types and storage? Sure, but the amount of testing that you would have to do would be so complex and such a pain in the rear that it doesn't really make sense. So unfortunately, we just can't know that. I used to love, Netflix used to do this thing where every time that they stood up a VM, they would run storage tests against it and CPU tests. And if they didn't get the numbers they expected for that particular VM type, they would simply trash it and create a new one. So that way they avoided problems like noisy neighbors or bad hardware. But that's so far beyond what other people will do these days. So why, Wiron says, why should you use a stored procedure? If you have something that's doing something complicated, like a big long transaction, and you don't want to manage that back and forth communication from the app server up to the database server, say you've got to do a checkout process that involves charging the customer's credit card and all kinds of other things, stored procedures help you have one piece of logic that all takes place on the database server. Another reason you might use it is if you have multiple front ends. Maybe you've got a website, maybe you've got a Java API and other things, and you want to just write the code for the database part once and then reuse it from multiple places. Stored procedures are great for that as well. zxta asks, how does a database like Redis work? This is a really good question. What you want to do is Google for how to write a database. Doesn't that sound weird? If you Google for how to write a database, there are a bunch of open source college courses where they walk you through writing a database from start to finish. And in that, you start to learn all of the trade-offs that different databases make. If you want to dig deeply into it, that's a beautiful way to do it. Google for how to write a database, and you'll find a bunch of different college courses that you can choose from there, and they're all free. Let's see, Ailos asks, was the drawing concluded? Yes, and I did a video for it about back at the time announcing who the winner was as well. Ross asks, when I'm developing an application, what indicators would trigger the use of SQL Server versus Postgres? I get this question all the time, and the best way to answer it is to go to enterpriseready.io. It's totally free, doesn't cost anything. I'm not affiliated in it with it whatsoever. It's just a really good website, enterpriseready.io. And then there are a bunch of guides in there for the kinds of things that enterprises look for if you're writing an application and selling it to an enterprise. I'm going to give you an example. Authentication, single sign-on authentication with Azure Entra ID, aka what used to be Active Directory. Enterprises want their users to be able to log in to the database for things like reporting tools or whatever, using their Active Directory account. Things like that are stuff that enterprises just expect by default. It's part of a requirement. You're selling into big enterprises. If you're not landing your application, your database inside that enterprise, you may not need that. But for those of us who do get involved with selling apps into enterprises, that's a great place to start. There are many other reasons that you would want to use SQL Server over Postgres. The big thing, though, by far is Postgres is cheap compared to SQL Server. So you don't want to use it until you have to. But enterpriseready.io gives you some of the reasons why you might have to. Next up, user on TikTok says, do you have plans for Postgres training? I learned a lot from your videos that I can adapt. Thanks. Absolutely, yes. I am working on Postgres training classes now. I don't pre-announce them just because sometimes life gets in the way. I actually wanted them to be already shipping by now, but just sometimes life gets in the way and other priorities hit. But yes, I am absolutely working on those and excited for those. Tadim says, what about Mongo versus JSON in Postgres? Generally speaking, I don't get into JSON storage, whether it's in MongoDB or Postgres, so I wouldn't be qualified to give pros and cons. I would say use as few databases as you practically can because it's hard to manage databases and it gets complex. So if you need both relational and JSON storage, start with Postgres. If you are just dumping JSON into somewhere, look at something like MongoDB. Let's see here. Ailos says, I use cluster on SQL Server on physical devices. How do we determine storage I/O values? Now, what I would step back is and ask, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Very often people get razor sharp focused on one metric because it's the metric they know the most about. But what I would ask is, why are you working on that metric? Do you have evidence that says storage is the #1 bottleneck for my end user queries? To figure that out, that's where my mastering server tuning class comes in. In my mastering server tuning class, I teach you how to measure your top bottleneck in SQL Server, find the queries that are causing that bottleneck, and then based on that bottleneck, I tell you where to go next inside SQL Server. Should you look at query tuning? Should you look at index tuning? What settings should you change? I tell you what I never tell people to do is reformat their drives in order to improve storage performance. Because if you reformat your drives, right, that's a major outage. You would have to go set up a new server, log ship over to it, availability group over to it, whatever, fail stuff over to it, then blow away, set up the new drive the way you want, fail over to it, blow away the old drives. It's so work intensive and it's such a long outage that it's just not worth it. Tim says, how do you land a SQL job? And I'm going to change Tim's question just a little. How do you land a full-time SQL job? The way you land a full-time SQL job is you get experience on your resume doing a part-time SQL job. Tim's like, wait a minute, that didn't answer the question, Brent. How do I get a part-time SQL job? What you do is, in your current job, focus more on SQL. Focus more on SQL. What I mean by that is if you're a developer, start spending more and more time with the database, focus on the query tuning and index tuning aspects of your job, and then gradually you can become a full-time either SQL developer or a database administrator. That career path is extremely common. People will go into development and mature in their development route, doing more and more SQL Server work, Postgres work, whatever, and then gradually focus on it full time. The company will be more comfortable gradually giving you more and more database work because they already know you on the team and they trust you. Another common route into it is becoming a systems administrator, DevOps, a site reliability engineer, and then do more and more work on the database. Focus on security, configuration, performance tuning aspects of that. And then you'll be able to spend more and more time on the database. Both of those gradually result in you getting a full-time SQL Server job or Postgres or MongoDB, whatever it is that you're interested in. The reason why I like recommending that aspect of your career is that if you decide you don't want to do databases, or if you want to change the database that you work with over time, that's a relatively easy change. You know what almost never happens? Is you can almost never, thanks for the follow, Yuri, I appreciate it. And for the rest of you, if you enjoy this, by all means, follow and you can get notifications as I go live. You can get notifications about my videos and whatnot. I almost never see people fresh out of college and go directly into databases because the database tends to be the most valuable thing the company has. It's mission critical, it's where their customers live, their sales live, all of that stuff. So they don't want to just hand those keys over to a stranger who's never worked full-time in a database before. That's why that slow, gradual assumption of responsibilities tends to help. Tadim says, do you have any experience with SingleStore? I do not. Ailos says, RPO, what the what? Aidos, you're not really asking a question there. Feel free to ask a question, but now you're just kind of throwing out terms there. Or if this is related to your earlier storage stuff, feel free to shoot me an email if you go to brentozar.com, because it sounds like this question's a little beyond the back and forth that we can do quickly over a live stream. Feel free to go to brentozar.com, click contact up at the top. People hire me all the time for consulting, and I can tell you really quickly if this is an appropriate question for a training class or if it is something that makes more sense as a consulting gig. Next up from PolGab, Raphra asks, if ChatGPT or Gemini used your online blogs to train models, would you be okay with that? I think the ship has already sailed on that because I've already asked ChatGPT, hey, what does Brent Ozar look like? Or take the writing style of Brent Ozar and explain this topic. and it works. Now, it's not super accurate. For example, it said that I liked a Toyota Prius, which is not entirely true. It did understand that I like cars, but it didn't quite get or it was a Model Y. I think it was a Model Y that it said I liked, and I can't stand Model Ys. Oh my God, they look amazing from the outside. They're beautiful cars. They're really styled well, but man, for the price, the interior is just garbage. It's just gross. The dashboard is gross. It's not that I don't like electric cars. The instant that Porsche's 718 comes out electric next year, I will buy one of those. I'm super excited for that. Anyway, I think that the ship has already sailed on that. I'm a really big believer in Stoic philosophy, Stoicism, that lets you just focus on what are the things that I can change, what are the things that I can't change. And if it's something that I can't change, I just don't care about it. It's just not a concern to me in any way, shape, or form. So I think that that ship has long since sailed. I think that there are people who have more at stake in it. Like if you're Stephen King, the novelist, or J.K. Rowling, the novelist, you probably are very passionate about all kinds of inappropriate things. I'm not a fan of J.K. Rowling for many, many reasons. But if you're one of those authors, then you probably work really hard to make sure that the AI doesn't rip off your work and like write new novels in your own voice. Those people can fight that battle. I'm going to focus on just the stuff that I can change. Next up, Yoichi asks, what is your opinion of NetApp files for Azure SQL VM? Such a small percentage of my customer base uses Azure relative to AWS. It's nothing against Azure. I'm just not a big Azure consultant. The way that a lot of Microsoft consulting works is if you're an Azure user, you tend to look for a Microsoft partner. And Microsoft partners, there are rules about that with the number of people you have to have on staff, the number of Microsoft certified people. I don't believe at all in Microsoft certifications. I reduced my consulting staff, years ago. So I'm not a good fit as a Microsoft partner. Plus, Microsoft will throw you consulting money in virtual dollars that you can spend with a Microsoft partner. So I don't get access to any of that either. I don't want it. It's a low billable rate. So I'm just not the person to ask on that. Theoretically, I love the idea of shared storage in the cloud that works well with failover clusters and works well with syncing data back on premises or over to other regions. That's only the theory. I don't know anybody using it, so that's why I can't answer that well. Let's see, over in TikTok chat, 3DaysGrace, what an interesting name. That's an interesting name. It says, how do I avoid losing connectivity between the database and applications on failover? So you can't, because let's say that you say insert a row. Let's say your application says insert a row and sends that command over to the database. And while that database is working, it goes down. Well, when it fails over to the other server, what happened to your insert? Maybe it succeeded, maybe it didn't. There's no way of knowing whether your insert succeeded or not until you go connect over to the other database and check. That idea of connect over to the other database and check to see what's going on is way beyond what any kind of firewall type thing can do. Any kind of a device that sits in between you and your database. So there are connectivity layers that you can put in your application. There are things like retries that you can put in, timeouts. That is unfortunately left up to you. So you can say at the driver level or your query execution layer, think like Dapper if you're using an ORM or Entity Framework. You can say, I want to override the connection properties. If the query takes out or times out after, say, 30 seconds, retry it again. But it's up to you because you obviously wouldn't want to retry the same order twice or cast an upvote twice, whatever it is. But that is unfortunately left up to you. You would think it'd be easy in this day and age, but unfortunately it just doesn't work that way. Next up, user asks, what's the difference between leaderless and multi-leader replication for databases? I don't do replication at all. So I've done it in the past, think more than a decade ago, but it is such a giant pain in the rear to manage. For example, you have to worry about dealing with who wins in the event of conflicts. Two users make a change into two different places, and for some reason both changes take place. You end up with a replication conflict. How do you solve that replication conflict? That's going to be up to you and writing your own conflict resolution code. I don't want to touch anywhere near that. It's not enjoyable for me, so I just don't do it. User says, why should I limit the connection pool from my server, or limit the connection pooling on my server? And you're probably asking about things like Postgres, where the connection pooling is not built in. With SQL Server, it's built in, so I just don't have to worry about it. SQL Server is really good at reusing, SQL Server and the drivers are really good at reusing connections, so that makes it really easy. I don't know anything about Postgres connection pooling, so I wouldn't even begin to tell you a good answer. I think part of a good skill in taking questions like this is knowing what I can give you good answers on, and knowing where I just have to punt and say, I have no idea, I don't touch that one at all. Clip says, can you talk about indexing? Absolutely, I can. So that's an example of things that I talk about a lot versus things that I don't. I have a class called How to Think Like the Engine, where I use physical pieces of paper to help explain how indexing works. It is totally free. I think it's something that every data professional should start with. If you go to the link in my bio and enroll in my free classes, How to Think Like the Engine is about an hour long, totally free. And I explain all kinds of cool stuff about indexing in there live in real time so that you can go see how it works. Over and over again, people just rave about that course and tell me how much it helped them understand indexes. So check that out in the link in my bio. Clip says, thanks, I'm joining your class. Cool, I hope you like it. It's one of those where I'm really proud of. I worked on it for years and I just re-recorded it. I tend to re-record my material from time to time to make sure that folks can see the latest and greatest with camera technology too, and audio, make sure my audio is good. And then we got one more question over in PollGab. Steve Harrington, another Dead by Daylight reference, very nice, says, is it recommended to use an allocation unit size of 64K on TempDB drives for Azure SQL DBs? How do you do this if the drive is ephemeral? If the drive is ephemeral, what you're going to want to do is, after startup, reformat it as 64K NTFS allocation units, then set up the TempDB directories, then start the SQL Server service. If I remember right, the Azure Infrastructure as a Service agent does this for you. It doesn't do it automatically. It's something that you have to do yourself. Now, in terms of should you do it, I mentioned earlier on in the stream that any cloud vendor has lots of different solid state drive types. You can move from one to the other depending on where your machine boots up, and they can change that at any time without warning. So there's not really a good biblical answer as to what's the best NTFS allocation unit size, and the amount of work that it would take in order to measure it would be stratospheric. It would take absolutely forever, so you just don't see people doing that. Let's see here. Oh my God, Tico says, you should talk about how the best warehouse is a lake house. I actually don't do data warehousing at all. I don't do data warehousing, not because it's not cool. I think it's amazingly cool, but the problem is the technology changed so fast over the last decade. There is a book that you might like, Tico, and I have it on my drive and I have not read it yet. Deciphering Data Architectures. Deciphering Data Architectures by James Serra, S-E-R-R-A. And James, it's on O'Reilly. James sent it to me like 6 months ago and I haven't read it yet. Choosing between a modern data warehouse, data fabric, data lakehouse, and data mesh. James is an architect for Microsoft, and has a great knack for explaining really complex technologies really simply. So even though I haven't read the book yet, I feel guilty for not reading it. I don't do a whole lot, I don't do any advisory consultations on which like architecture you should choose. That book, I think you'll love that book, Deciphering Data Architectures. And I don't get anything for promoting that. That's not something that I get paid to say. And I like James, but that I have a faith that you're going to like that book. 3DaysGrace says, wow, I joined something super interesting on TikTok. We need more content like that. This is one of the things I love about TikTok, is that once you stumble into the right parts of the algorithm, there's so much stuff. For example, I don't play Grand Theft Auto. I just can't get invested enough to get good at that. I tend to play shorter games like Dead by Daylight. But there's a Grand Theft Auto creator. I love Omar. I can just watch Omar's live streams and videos all the time, and I have the best time doing it. But you know, there's these weird niche streams that you get into that are absolutely phenomenal. Let's see, this Risto says, my XAMPP shows me the MySQL error, what happened with that, and how can I fix that error? One of the best ways that you can do it is go to dba.stackexchange.com, dba.stackexchange.com, post the exact error message that you're getting, and then people can help from there. But just make sure to post the exact error message you're getting. Under the C, the letter C says, how do I use Redis to cache data effectively? So the first thing that you want to know is Redis won't do the work for you. It's something that your application has to first go check Redis looking for the answer. If the answer isn't there, go run the query and then push the answer up into Redis. That's left up to you. That's not something that's built in to anybody's databases themselves. You can't, Dapper has the ability to do this if you use Dapper as an ORM. Okay, so once you understand that, the concept of storing query answers, the big thing you need to know is that Redis is like a key value store. It does a whole lot of other stuff, but one way to use it is key value store. The key is the query. Whatever query you are going to run, use an abridged version of that as the key, so that way it'll work no matter what you're looking for. Don't think like user ID or product ID. Use the query itself as the key. Next up, let's see here. Ailos says, there are different plans for the same query. Is there a video about that? Yes, the thing that you're looking for is called parameter sniffing. Once you know that the term is parameter sniffing, it's a whole new world. There are all kinds of things that you're going to find out there online, including for me. If you want to see my videos about parameter sniffing, you can search for Brent Ozar parameter sniffing. And then you'll find a ton of videos about them, and it'll blow your mind about how intricate that is. I have training classes on parameter sniffing. Don't spend $1 on those until you devour the free resources, because there's so much free stuff out there. And if you've never heard the term parameter sniffing before, you may get everything that you need just from the free resources. So start there. Let's see here. Next up, Ifioma says, talk about partitions. So it depends on the database that you're using. In Postgres, partitioning is a very popular way to solve problems with vacuuming, for example. In SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server, the only reason that you would do partitioning is to do something called sliding window loads, where you load an entire partition in all at once and you drop an entire partition out. People think somehow that partitioning is going to magically make queries go faster, and it does not. Partitioning makes select queries go slower than plain old indexing. If you can do just a plain old index, you're going to see better query performance than you would with partitioning. And people who love partitioning always get angry, but that's not true. I got this one edge case scenario. And then we go dig into it together, and it turns out partitioning really is making their queries go slower. So just be careful with that. Leolog says, any recommendations on where to best learn architecture? When is a data mart or lake warehouse best fit? That comes back to that book I mentioned just a second ago, Deciphering Data Architectures by James Serra. Start there, Deciphering Data Architectures by James Serra. It's a book out on O'Reilly. Next up, 3DaysGrace says, wow, Brent, how are you not losing such inspiration for new technology? I love databases. I love databases. I wish I could live to like 300 years old, not so that I could see what happens in the future, but just so that I could have enough time to digest what's already happening now. There are so many cool things I'm just always amazed by. And the hard part is picking and choosing which ones I'm going to actually learn versus what I'm going to do when I turn off the webcast and I go do other stuff, because I have family obligations or things that I need to work on myself and stuff, business stuff too. But I just love it. It's such an interesting technology. There are so many cool things to learn. I wish, for example, that I knew C, the language. I wish I could code in C so that I could read open source databases and get a better handle on how they work. I went to the Postgres Development Conference, PGConf in Vancouver, which is for people who write databases, who write the Postgres source code. Not because I can't even read the database source code, let alone write it, but I just wanted to be around the kind of environment where people make decisions about what they're going to do and hear their process for how their thoughts work, how they prioritize things. I'm so mesmerized by everything in data. Similarly, I have a similar obsession with cars. I have a similar obsession with videography, like all the technology behind videos. There's so many things that I would love to learn, just intellectually curious there. I'm always blown away when people say that if they won the lotto, they couldn't retire because they can't imagine not working. I can totally imagine not working. I could spend the rest of my life learning about stuff that I want to know. There are so many things I want to know, so it's very exciting and contagious for me. Gambit says, how do you determine the correct amount of TempDB and their sizes? If you just want a quick general rule of thumb, 25% of the size of the data on the server. So for example, if you have 1 terabyte worth of data, 25% of that would be 250 gigs. That's a good starting point. And then break that up into 4 data files, all equally sized. Now, that's a good starting point. There are many cases where you need more. There are many cases where you can get by with less. To go into those, I have a class called Fundamentals of TempDB. That's not one of my free classes, that's actually a paid class. So if you don't have the money to go learn that, and it's fine if you don't. If you don't have the money to go learn that, start with that 25% and 4 guideline and go from there. Jay Chandra says, it's been a while since I looked into SQL Server internals. Can you scale it out horizontally these days? No. SQL Server is not a scale out horizontal kind of database, and it never will be. It's just not built in that way, shape, or form at all. You can scale out reads horizontally. There are a few complex ways of doing that, but we're still bottlenecked at just one writer. There's some tricks that people can use around multi-master replication, but the database itself does not scale horizontally. Let's see here. So I think we're done there. I think I'm all caught up there in terms of questions. Make sure I got the last one over in PollGab. Perfect. So we've been going for about an hour here. So if you enjoyed this, feel free to follow, subscribe, whatever down below so that you get notifications whenever I post new content. And hope you enjoyed it. And I will see y'all on my next office hours. Adios.